Imagine for a moment that you are a woman living over 3,000 years ago in the sweltering, sun-drenched capital of ancient Egypt. You've missed a cycle, your body feels different, and a creeping anxiety begins to take hold. In the modern world, a missed period sends you to the nearest pharmacy to buy a sterile plastic stick for a few dollars. 3 minutes later, a pink line gives you absolute, scientific certainty. But in 1350 BC, there are no pharmacies. There are no ultrasound machines, no blood tests, and no understanding of the microscopic hormones flooding your system. Pregnancy in the ancient world was not just a medical condition. It was a matter of life and death, shrouded in mystery, magic, and the terrifying whims of the gods. You need to know if you are carrying a child, and more importantly, you need to know if it is a boy or a girl. So, you visit a local priest-physician, expecting some bizarre, superstitious ritual involving burning incense, chanting incantations, or sacrificing an animal. Instead, he hands you 2 small linen bags. One is filled with seeds of emmer, wheat, and the other is filled with barley. His instructions are simple, yet completely absurd to the modern ear. Urinate on both bags every single day. If the seeds sprout, you are pregnant. If the barley grows faster, you will have a boy. If the wheat grows faster, you will have a girl. If nothing grows, you are not pregnant. For centuries, modern historians looked at this ancient text and laughed. It was dismissed as mere folklore, a quaint and ignorant superstition from a civilization that didn't know any better. But in the 1960s, a team of medical researchers decided to put this 3,000-year-old magic trick to the test in a modern laboratory. And what they discovered completely shattered our understanding of ancient medicine, proving that the Egyptians were utilizing advanced biological science thousands of years before we even had a word for it. To truly understand how mind-blowing this discovery is, we first have to understand the document that gave us this information. The instructions for this bizarre pregnancy test come to us primarily from a remarkable artifact known as the Berlin Medical Papyrus, along with similar fragments found in the Carlsberg Papyrus collection. These aren't just random scribbles. They are meticulous medical textbooks compiled by scribes and physicians of the New Kingdom. When early Egyptologists first translated these texts in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were astounded by the sheer volume of medical knowledge. The Egyptians were performing complex surgeries, setting broken bones, and treating dental abscesses. Yet, interwoven with this highly practical, empirical knowledge were spells to ward off demons and recipes that called for the dung of crocodiles and the blood of bats. So, when the translators read the passage about peeing on wheat and barley, they naturally threw it into the magic and superstition category. After all, how could a bag of dirt and grain possibly detect a human pregnancy? The logic of the ancient Egyptians seemed purely symbolic to these early historians. In Egyptian mythology, grain was intimately tied to the god Osiris, the lord of the underworld and the deity of resurrection and fertility. Every year, the Nile River would flood its banks, depositing rich, black silt over the arid land. When the waters receded, the Egyptians planted their crops, and life miraculously sprang from the dead earth. Osiris was often depicted with green skin, representing this very agricultural rebirth. The Egyptians even made Osiris beds wooden frames shaped like the god, filled with soil and seeds. As the seeds sprouted, they symbolized life triumphing over death. Therefore, the Victorian historians concluded, the pregnancy test was just sympathetic magic. A pregnant woman is a vessel of life, bringing a new human into the world. A seed is a vessel of life, bringing a new plant into the world. It was a poetic metaphor, a beautiful but scientifically useless ritual born from a culture obsessed with agricultural fertility. They assumed that out of pure statistical probability, the seeds would occasionally sprout, giving the illusion that the test worked, reinforcing the superstition generation after generation. It was a neat, condescending explanation that allowed modern science to feel vastly superior to the primitive ancients. And for a long time, the modern world genuinely believed it was vastly superior. But if we look at how pregnancy testing evolved in Europe over the subsequent centuries, the Egyptian method starts to look less like magic and more like genius. During the Middle Ages in Europe, medicine regressed terribly. The most popular method for diagnosing pregnancy and virtually any other illness was a practice known as uroscopy. So-called piss prophets would take a flask of a woman's urine and stare at it, examining its color, holding it up to the light, and even tasting it to detect the sweet flavor of diabetes or the supposed visual cloudiness of a pregnant womb. By the 16th century, European doctors were telling women to urinate on a latch or a piece of metal to see if it left a rusty outline, or suggesting they mix their urine with wine to see if it coagulated. It was all guesswork, draped in the pseudoscience of the four humors. Even when we reached the 20th century, the era of cars, electricity, and the dawn of modern medicine, our pregnancy tests were barbaric, incredibly expensive, and shockingly cruel. In the 1920s, scientists finally discovered the hormone HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, which is produced by the placenta shortly after the embryo attaches to the uterine lining. This was the holy grail of pregnancy detection. But they didn't have a plastic stick with a chemically treated strip to detect it. Instead, they used the Aschheim-Zondek test, commonly known as the AZ test. To find out if a woman was pregnant, doctors would collect her urine and inject it into an immature female mouse or rat. Then, they would wait a few days, kill the animal, dissect it, and examine its ovaries. If the woman was pregnant, her HCG would have caused the animal's ovaries to swell and produce eggs. A few years later, this evolved into the rabbit test. Thousands upon thousands of rabbits were sacrificed purely to confirm pregnancies. By the 1940s, we had the Hogben test, which involved injecting the urine into a live African clawed frog. If the frog laid eggs within 24 hours, the woman was pregnant. The frog didn't have to die, which was a step up, but it meant hospitals had to keep vast, loud, and incredibly smelly aquariums filled with hundreds of amphibians just to tell women if they were going to be mothers. This was the state of the art. This was the pinnacle of Western biological science, injecting the bodily fluids of human women into rodents and amphibians. And it was against this backdrop, in the year 1963, that a medical historian named Dr. Paul Galiungui, along with a team of researchers, decided to look back at the Berlin Papyrus. They were curious. Was it really just symbolic magic? Or did the ancient Egyptians know something that we had forgotten? They decided to recreate the 3,000-year-old experiment using strict, modern scientific controls. The researchers gathered urine samples from a large group of women. Some were pregnant, some were not. They also collected urine from men as a control group. They set up the bags of emmer, wheat, and barley exactly as the ancient texts prescribed. For several days, they meticulously watered the seeds with the respective urine samples, waiting to see what would happen. If the Victorian historians were right, the high salt content and acidity of human urine would simply kill the seeds, or they would sprout randomly regardless of who provided the sample. But as the days passed, a distinct and undeniable pattern began to emerge in the laboratory. The bags watered with the urine of men and non-pregnant women remained entirely barren. The seeds refused to germinate. They simply rotted in the soil. But the bags watered with the urine of the pregnant women were sprouting. Bright green shoots of wheat and barley were pushing their way up through the soil, thriving and growing with incredible vitality. The researchers were absolutely stunned. When they tabulated the final data, the results sent shockwaves through the medical history community. The ancient Egyptian barley and wheat test accurately detected human pregnancy in an astonishing 70% of cases. It wasn't magic. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't a lucky guess based on agricultural metaphors. It was biology. It was an ancient, highly effective biological assay. But how was it possible? How could a handful of seeds react to a human pregnancy? The answer lies not in HCG, the hormone we look for today, but in another powerful chemical floating through a pregnant woman's bloodstream. Estrogen. When a woman becomes pregnant, her estrogen levels skyrocket, rising higher than they ever will at any other point in her life. Estrogen is a steroid hormone, and its primary function is to promote growth, the growth of the uterine lining, the growth of the placenta, the growth of the fetus. But here is the magnificent, deeply interconnected secret of biology that the Egyptians stumbled upon. The chemical structure of human estrogen is remarkably similar to certain plant hormones. Plants produce compounds called phytoestrogens, which help regulate their own growth, seed germination, and flowering. Because the molecular structures are so closely aligned, the massive flood of estrogen in a pregnant woman's urine acts as an intense, organic fertilizer for the seeds. It stimulates the dormant embryos inside the grains of wheat and barley, tricking them into breaking their dormancy and accelerating their growth. The urine of men and non-pregnant women does not have this massive concentration of estrogen, so the natural salts and waste products in the urine simply inhibit the seeds from growing. 3,000 years ago, without microscopes, without a concept of the endocrine system, and without the faintest idea of what a molecule was, the ancient Egyptians had successfully isolated a biological marker for pregnancy. They had created a test that was non-invasive, incredibly cheap, totally painless, and required no animal cruelty. In many ways, their method was vastly superior, and certainly more humane, than the rabbit and frog test that dominated the 20th century. Now, there was one catch. The researchers in 1963 noted that while the test was 70% accurate at detecting the pregnancy itself, the gender prediction aspect, the idea that barley meant a boy and wheat meant a girl, was a total failure. The seeds sprouted indiscriminately, regardless of the fetus's sex. This part of the test likely was born from the symbolic magic the early historians had obsessed over. The Egyptian word for barley, it, was masculine, while the word for emmer wheat, bidet, was feminine. It was a linguistic and symbolic leap of faith that didn't pan out in the petri dish. But to dismiss the entire procedure because the gender reveal didn't work is to miss one of the greatest medical achievements of antiquity. Think about the profound observation skills required to invent this. Someone, thousands of years ago, had to notice a correlation between the waste products of a pregnant woman and the accelerated growth of crops. Perhaps a woman repeatedly relieved herself in the same patch of wild grain near the riverbank, and an observant farmer or physician noticed that this specific patch grew faster and taller than the rest. They then had the scientific curiosity to test this hypothesis, isolate the variables by putting the seeds in separate bags, and apply it as a standardized medical diagnostic tool across an entire empire. It is a stunning testament to the empirical method. Long before the Greeks claimed to have invented rational medicine, the Egyptians were actively observing cause and effect, experimenting with their environment, and developing practical, functional medical technologies. The story of the barley pregnancy test forces us to confront our own modern arrogance. We look back at history as a straight line, a steady march from primitive ignorance to modern enlightenment. We assume that because the ancients believed in gods with animal heads and built massive tombs for their kings, they must have been intellectually simple. We see their spells and incantations and we stop looking, assuming there is no real science hidden beneath the mysticism. But the truth is, history is not a straight line. It is a complex, twisting narrative of forgotten knowledge and rediscovered brilliance. The ancient Egyptians didn't separate science from religion. To them, observing the natural world and understanding its mechanics was a way of understanding the divine. The estrogen in the urine was the magic, and the magic was the biology. So the next time you look at a modern piece of medical technology, a sleek plastic device that gives you an answer in minutes, don't just think about the scientists in white coats who engineered it. Take a moment to remember the priest-physicians of the Nile, standing in the blistering heat, handing a terrified young woman a bag of seeds. They didn't have our vocabulary, and they didn't have our tools, but they asked the exact same questions we do today, and they found an answer that was written in the very soil of the earth. The past isn't as primitive as we think. Sometimes the oldest magic in the book turns out to be the purest science of all.